Welcome everyone to Fintech Week London City-to-City Europe panel. My name is Natalie Staniewicz. I'm Fintech lead at Accenture based in Vienna, Austria. And it's my pleasure to moderate this panel today and guide you through the session. We will be discussing an important topic, which is how to boost scale-ups within a European ecosystem, which is very diverse. And for this, we will have different viewpoints that will be coming together. We will talk about regulatory, about business needs, about the power of ecosystem, about funding, and also about what strategy we really want in Europe regarding scale-ups and fintech ecosystem. So in a short while, I will actually ask several speakers to join us. There will be 5. We will be gathering views from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from Poland, from Austria, and from Sweden. So let me introduce them to you. We will have Don Ginsel from Holland Fintech. Don is CEO and founder, and he will bring in the European and also Dutch perspective, of course. We have Joan Carette. She is partner at the law firm Simont Braun in Belgium. She really takes care of fintech payments, financial regulation. Then the third speaker that will be joining us is Boguslawa. She actually has 2 different views. One, the Polish CE one, being the founder and board member of MIT Enterprise Forum CE and Accelerator, but also she knows Silicon Valley and the US perspective because she's the founder of an organization called Founders Partners. She will tell us more about it later. The fourth one will be Lisa Marie Fassl. She is the CEO of Female Founders, but also startup advisor to the Austrian Ministry of Digitalization, important word, and economy, and thus brings the female entrepreneurship, founder, and also the policy perspective to the table. And then last but not least, we have Anders Norlin, who is the CEO of Findec from Sweden, and he will be bringing in the Nordic perspective. So a very exciting panel, different viewpoints. Let's kick this right off. So I'd like to ask my team to bring all our speakers on stage so that we can start the discussion. Brilliant, very good. So pleasure to have you all with me today. And let's kick this right off. So I said scale-ups are an important factor because of course we have a lot of startups in Europe. We have an innovative ecosystem that is booming, but how do we really get them to grow to a stage where they can nurture also our economy, where they're an important factor and not only maybe niche players, but really the ones that can boost also us in Europe and innovation here. So the question is, how can we achieve this? And the first thing that I would like to think through with you is maybe Don, from your Holland fintech perspective, but also really, you know, a lot of different other European networks, the champions that you've seen, the ones that have grown into scale-ups. Are there any learnings or best practices that we can take from them? Just unmute, exactly.
Sure, happy to elaborate on that. Thank you, Natalie, and really great to be here as part of this panel of distinguished colleagues from across the region. I think let's say I always would like to challenge the question or whether we should all be wanting to have scale-ups, right? So I think it's really much of a sort of economic desire from governments to actually have economic champions in their region, because that actually extends their power to a certain extent into the economy. While at the same time, I believe that there's also quite some nice examples of parties that just thrive by building startups and actually not scale-ups per se, or at least not retaining them in their nation. Think about Israel, for example. So I think it's always good to try and reimagine as well how you could facilitate the economy. And that could, I think, also be with thousands of small parties rather than one big one. Of course, on the downside, I think you could definitely say that, you know, the big tech players that we're familiar with especially from Asia and the US, have a very large impact in the way that we're able to consume our digital life, as well as how the economic game is being played. So from that perspective, we might want to think that we want these kind of players also with a European mindset. And so from that perspective, I can definitely understand, of course, this need. And I think maybe I just want to focus on one ingredient here, which I think is empowering startups to become scale-ups, and that's competition. And I think that's one of the things that I think we might be worst at in Europe, because we tend to be very nice to each other, while actually we should be fighting for the loot and try to, you know, concentrate, try to do the same thing, but be the best at it. And I think that's, if you have that, if you have a really fierce competition, I think that's when the biggest champions will appear. So I think that's actually, and that's also where I think you'll see that very gradually Europe is maturing, because we see a higher concentration of tech companies, of startups turning into scale-ups, and that density, I think, of tech solutions is creating, I think, that competition that we need.
So competition is an important key ingredient. Anders, from the Nordic perspective, because you had a lot of players that have grown, right? Skype, Klarna, Trustly, there's many. What do you think about this? Is it competition or some other key ingredients to let them grow?
So thank you for having me, Natalie. Of course, competition is deadly crucial, I guess, to verify your business modeling. In Sweden, you have, I think the role modeling has been extremely important. So you have one successful story, then it creates two, it creates four. A little bit about how it's developed in the Silicon Valley. And by that, you have people with experience and capital. So for instance, if you look at Klarna, there's an article in Sifted about the Klarna mafia. I think it's 30 to 40 people from Klarna that today, not all of them, but a lot of them are engaged in fintechs. So by that, they bring not only capital, but experience to go international. So you have it early in the company structure. So I think that's crucial. And also connected to incubators and accelerators. You get injected with that experience. You have role modeling early when you're creating your teams, you're creating your business modeling. So you have it as a guiding star when you develop your business. And actually I had a talk with the founder of Tink, and he said it's the last mental barrier was when Klarna is doing their global expansion on their own, not being acquired. That's the final barrier for them. Now, maybe it's not super happy about them being acquired by Visa, but if you get $2 billion on your table, it's difficult to resist. But otherwise, it's also a political dimension to keep those companies locally growing internationally, because then you grow the headquarter. So to a certain extent, it's super happy to have those companies succeeding, but from a country level or regional level or European level, you want to see them stay in Europe, not being acquired by US giants long term.
Right. What do the others think about this consolidation topic? Is there actually any thought about this, or otherwise also, Bogi, from your side, because in Poland, the banks are actually quite strong to drive also the startup ecosystem. Do you have any view on this European strategy consolidation, or also who should push? Just the unmute button, no? It's our worst.
I know this story. So we started out as MIT Enterprise Forum Poland, and we quickly realized that we should really think broader, and we started thinking through the region of Central and Eastern Europe. And I wanted to stress again what Anders said, that it's very important to create these ecosystems and give the role models. Because the ecosystem, the power of the ecosystem is amazing. You know, Central and Eastern Europe was really removed and isolated from the rest of Europe technologically. And by creating an ecosystem and connecting people, that created so much good energy that basically, you know, business happens through relations. And in startups, the time to get critical information is super important. So when we create an ecosystem, the time goes down, and creating a bigger, like, European ecosystem, I think, is very important. Of course, innovation is local, so, you know, we should not like create power structures, but like linking accelerators with each other, I think, is very important to create some sort of a scale. What we are doing at Founder Partners is we are basically joining young founders. So we're experienced founders, we've built companies, and we're joining young founders and helping them along the way in decision-making, in basically strategy, moving things along. And I think that creates an enormous power if you put young people with experienced people. So I think more models like that, it would be very useful. We work out of Silicon Valley, so we actually bring startups to the US, and there is an enormous power of creating like one market because they are in, you know, the US market is huge. I don't know if we can repeat this model in Europe. I think it's much tougher because of the languages, the cultures, and, you know, I mean, we have to fit our national thing. So this is kind of to conclude that aspect. And on the banking side, Natalie, what you've asked, you know, can banks be instrumental? I'm not yet sure. What I observe in Poland is that each bank kind of works in their own silo. We try to bring all the different banks to our accelerator and work in the open innovation model. We've encountered a lot of resistance. Every single bank built their own accelerator, and they're, you know, competing for startups, and, you know, they're claiming this is my startup, you know, when someone already finishes the application. So there's a lot of limitations that are being imposed on young companies, and that's not good.
Well, it's interesting, right? On the one side, supporting and building, maybe also giving the experience and maybe also capital or network, but at the other side, and not closing down innovation if you're partnering with a big.
Yes.
Yeah. Lisa, what do you actually see in the Austrian environment? Because if I can be frank, I'm also from Austria, right? If you compare it to other, like the Nordics, it's not as innovative of an ecosystem, they say. We can challenge this. And on the other side, in the last few years, there've been a lot of startups that have grown. What are some of the success factors, nevertheless, to build in such an ecosystem, and maybe some views from what you heard already?
Cool. Thanks for having me, first of all, and thanks for these excellent comments that we've already heard. So following up to some of the things that have already been said and something that we're seeing right now in the Austrian ecosystem. So on the one hand side, I totally agree to this role model part, because we've been working on the Austrian ecosystem for the past like 10 and 12 years, and things have developed, although the political situation and the support from the government is not where it could be, to be honest. So despite the framework that is not, let's call it optimal, companies are still growing. And what we're seeing right now is that we have our first 2 unicorns coming from the tech ecosystem, one being Bitpanda, so a fintech company, and the other one GoStudent, which is an educational company. And this is creating so much positive spirit, and so many people are now really getting excited and are really being soaked in this hype of entrepreneurship, and especially when it comes to the tech part. So I am really optimistic that we're going to see even more companies being started here, because also, and that's sort of more moving towards the political direction, and why I'm optimistic that also things are going to change on that level, is that by having these unicorns, this small community is getting more and more important, because this means that the valuation of these companies is actually higher than the market capitalization of some of the companies listed at Viennese Stock Exchange. So for the very first time, the broader audience, politics, and society is realizing that this really has this economic and also societal impact in terms of startups and scale-ups are creating jobs. So this is why I'm very convinced that ecosystems need that kind of role models, and also need scale-ups and unicorns. Leaving, of course, now this conversation about, well, capitalistic aspects beside, but just to create this buzz and create role models. So I think that's pretty important. From my perspective, it's pretty simple what ecosystems need, and what we especially need in Europe. It's a combination of 3 things. And now it seems like a bit easy equation, but I think it is basically, it's about talented and smart people, which we have in Austria, which we have basically across Europe. I think our biggest challenge at the moment as a continent basically is to keep them here and make sure that they enjoy living and growing companies here and working companies, obviously. The second aspect is money, where we definitely have a long way to go in Europe. And I think that's quite an interesting situation right now, because on the one hand side, we know that we have a lack of especially venture capital coming from European VC investors. On the other hand side, we are implementing FDI policies that are making it hard to get foreign investments coming from the US and Asia. So I think there's things going on here that we need to think of and come up with a clear strategy that makes sense. And I think the third aspect very much connected to this is actually smart policies that are future oriented and that are not trying to make life and business easy right now, but are really thinking like 10, 20, 30, maybe even 50 years ahead, making sure that we're having a very interesting future for all of us that makes sense from a personal and also from a business perspective. So I think it's a very interesting point in time that could be really crucial for the development of the whole European tech ecosystem.
So talent, money, and then policies. So possibly this is a good keyword for you, Joan, because you work with a lot of different fintech startups, but also startups in general, to explain to them and help them on their regulatory journey. So what have you seen with the ones that maybe were in your local ecosystem? What kind of barriers were there? What kind of topics have you already improved?
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that from a policy or regulatory point of view, one of difficult aspect for fintechs, whatever they are, startups, scale-ups, and so on, is that they are surrounded by regulations. That's for sure. But that if they want to have really international activities, it's a problem from a local point of view to understand everything, but you add a layer whenever you want to have cross-border activities, because basically, even though we have a lot of things that have been harmonized at the EU level, we still have huge differences, at least for some topics, from one member state to the other. And maybe I can take two examples, which will make it more practical. We see with COVID-19, we've seen a lot of discussions about how to onboard new customers across the EU, because no one could see each other anymore or come to the office or whatever. That's one thing. And the second one is a trendy project that we see for the moment also, which is the buy now, pay later. And in both cases, we have directives that potentially apply to those two topics, but for which the member states keep an important level of room for interpretation or even for the implementation. And for instance, regarding the digital onboarding, so really having new clients, without having them coming to the bank office or whatever, we have some countries which still now are very reluctant to accept any kind of verification of ID or identification of clients which do not involve some face-to-face interaction, which is a nightmare, obviously. But even for those who accept that, we see very important difference in terms of what they accept in practice. So for one member state, it will be, okay, you can just send the copy of your passport and have other additional verifications. Others, they will require biometrics or having video conference live and so on. Others will definitely reject those. So it's really a nightmare whenever you want to have cross-border activities, because even though generally you will be able to apply the law of your member states, when you work on the internet, you will still be subject in some case to these local laws. That's the same with the buy now, pay later project, which is basically subject potentially to the Consumer Credit Directive, but which provides the possibility for the member states to exempt some operation transaction credits from its scope of application. And again, there's important difference in implementation, with as consequence that for exactly the same project from one member state to the other, you will have to have a license or not. You will have to apply some rules in terms of protection of the consumers or not, or even sometimes have to apply some AML, so KYC obligations. So it's really very complicated still, due to this fragmentation in terms of legal framework in the EU.
So what do you think, Joan? But then also others can jump in. What could we do to improve this, right? Because we have this discussion already since a while with the European institutions to push them and harmonize different rules. So what could be a solution? Which way should we go?
So maybe, and then I will leave the floor to the others. The good thing is that the European Commission, European Parliament, they've seen that. So this is one of the topics on which they are trying to work. And they are really trying in two ways. So the first one is to avoid having different legal texts in the different member states. So working with what the lawyers know as regulations, meaning it's the same, for instance, for the GDPR. You take one text and it applies exactly in the same way in all member states. But that's not the only issue. and we see that even with GDPR, is that even with one text, you will still have difference in implementation or interpretation by the regulators. So the other trends, and we are talking about that, for instance, in terms of AML, is to try and have as much as possible also centralization of supervision of entities and also issuance of interpretation guidelines at the EU level. So that's something that is currently, and we see, for instance, new draft law, for instance, for the cryptos, it's the draft regulation. A lot of those are regulation. And so it's going in the right direction, let's say it like that, but still we have a long way to go.
What are the others thinking from maybe other hubs that are not so close to Brussels, right?
Close to Brussels, so but I fully agree. So I think it's a valid point, and I think this is where I think in general nation states are struggling with giving away power to a central European guidance, while at the same time we know that from an economic perspective it's the only way to go. And I think that's why I think all our regions are calling for more harmonization and unification of Europe from an economical perspective. Every business wants Europe as one market, but then this patch blankets that we got at the moment. But the national powers are, rather turning more nationalistic these days than unification, I would say. And it's a big challenge because let's say it's an opportunity at the same time, right? So you've got parties that are actually able to counter these variants with technology and allow companies and people to do business across borders pretty seamless, regardless of all these obstructions from a legal perspective, but at the same time you see that it's also a barrier for things moving forward faster.
What do you guys think?
Yeah, we have to remember that.
I can go next.
Please, ladies, both, maybe Bogi and then Lisa will jump to you.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that it's not also unified fully in other countries, bigger countries. In the US, there are a lot of state rules that if you are scaling throughout the US, of course, it's easier than, changing countries. But I think, when we have scale-ups, bigger companies, they can probably take on the challenge. I think the difficulty is with smaller companies. So also being smart business-wise, in which countries you grow and how you scale so that you have enough power and enough cash flow to actually adapt to the different regulations. But it's cost of doing business for European companies for sure.
Lisa, your view. You're also, right, helping the digital ministry to create an environment. So maybe from your daily perspective.
Yeah, trying to advise them or give them some advice. Very interesting. So I have to say, and I have to put this now first, I'm really happy that I'm not a politician, like not a full-time politician, having to make sometimes unpopular decisions, because I think still democracies are the best political sort of political system that we can imagine. But sometimes, especially when we see it on a European level, this can be a bit tough because, well, you can't make everyone happy, unfortunately. And following on to what I think Don was saying in his first statement, so I think competition is generally good, but I think what we're now seeing in Europe is that our member states are competing with each other from a tax and legal perspective and are trying to make it as attractive as possible to get founders there and have companies being founded in the specific countries. And I think I get it, why member states are doing this and why this is happening. And also I see that Corona had a very big impact on, more nationalistic movements, and I get it, but the bigger picture cannot be that we're more moving towards to even a more national system, a more nationalistic system, because it just doesn't make sense in the long run, because we're actually competing with the US, with Asia, we have Africa coming up. So there's a lot going on a geopolitical level. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind, and we need to ask ourselves, so what's the future of Europe and how can we do this? And I'm I would say a liberal person, and I definitely would also follow the argumentation that we've heard that harmonizing things and making things easier to do business would be a very important step and a very good step, but still a very unpopular one for obvious reasons. But I think there's no way around this.
So when you're already talking about the European level, what do you think, Lisa? What kind of strategy should we run in Europe? Because Don, for instance, said, well, maybe in some instances, niche players are good. right? What do you think? More platforms, more niche players? Which direction should we go in Europe?
So I think we should focus on specific topics, actually, because I think we have a very strong background in specific areas already. And I think this is a lot of things that are being related to really human-centered approaches when it comes to creating technology. And I think this is also something that Europe, also thinking about GDPR and other regulations here, what we're good at and what is sort of at the core of what we're doing, really putting humans and their advantage and their hopefully prosperous development first. So I think this kind of ethical approach could make sense, and combining this with specific topics like AI, for example, quantum computing. So really deep tech topics that should have a very specific approach, I guess. And also everything related to climate and really focusing also on this talent part could make sense. So I'm a big fan of putting strategic focuses, giving money to the strategic focuses and making sure that we become excellent in specific things, and instead of, trying to do this spray and pray and actually making everyone happy approach, and not trying to be good in particular things, but just finding a consensus to make sure that no one is being hurt and no one has hard feelings.
Can I just make one small comment on that? Because I think I see the policymakers very often have this hunch as well, that they want to say, okay, we're good at ABC, so we're going to put all our money on ABC. But it's history, right? So it's basically, you basically look backward and look at what were we good in, and that's where you're going to put your money in. And that's not how you do innovation, I believe. So I think, yes, of course, things that you're good in, you should amplify that. But at the same time, you need to keep an eye out and money available for things that you actually aren't aware of yet. So that's just one comment to make for all the policymakers that are listening in here, because the risk is otherwise we just keep on doing what we have been doing forever, including coal mines and gas and everything else.
Yeah, very much agree.
Very good. Any other thoughts on where we should put our focus on in Europe? What kind of topics we should be driving? We heard ethical, sustainability, AI, quantum computing. Not going into the broadness of the topics, but narrowing it down a bit. Any other thoughts on this? Are we good in payment sustainability in Europe, or is this actually not our strong horse?
Yeah, I think one area is the cross-border payments, of course. It's an ongoing issue, even on a country level somewhere. That's one area that we could take a much stronger position on the European level. In Nordics, you have the P27 project, is to align all the banking systems of the Nordic countries with 27 million inhabitants, which will be in place, I think, is somewhere next year. So I think that should be done across Europe, because it's unique in a Nordic sense, and it will be super unique if it could be done in a European level. So it's a lot of work locally on issues that should not be taken that much effort in terms of cross-border payments. I mean, still, it's fast to take a train to Copenhagen to send the money. It's a bit crazy. So I think that issue should be brought up, pushed much more. I think there's a lot of work on the European level. I mean, in Sweden, we have a separate organization. It's called the Swedish Fintech Association, which is an answer to the banking association, because there was no voice for the fintechs like Klarna, like Izettle, all those. And one big issue for them is actually to educate the politicians to get aware about this industry, because still on the GDP level, fintech is a fraction to a lot of other industries. But now it's getting attention in the Nordics. Because of growth of the fintechs. I think it's 20-25% year-on-year growth for more than 15 years. So it's a significant levels in both of a contribution to national level, number of employees is growing. So finally, at least here in Sweden, it's more attention. And also in Sweden, on European, it's more that, okay, policies is coming, and then we start to work with it. Now it's more, okay, how should we be involved in setting the policies from a fintech or a financial perspective? So that's a debate we have here in Sweden.
So maybe let me put out an hypothesis, Anders, on what you just said, because you discuss a lot about P27, for instance. That's a collaborative project, right?
Yes.
You have Swish, Bank ID, so there's a lot of collaborative projects there. So do we need more collaboration then in Europe? So less maybe the strong individual players pushing, but more collaboration. And how can we achieve that? Because it's not always so easy due to competition, right? The Nordics have done it well. Maybe the Belgians as well. Joan, you can share maybe some, because the Belgian is a small country, but a lot of collaboration. What can we learn from that? Huh?
Yes, indeed. Actually, we have a lot of cooperation between all kinds of stakeholders around the fintech world. So you will have fintechs collaborating together, but also a lot of cooperation, even though in the beginning they were reluctant to do so, but between the fintechs and the incumbent actors. What we have in Belgium, which is kind of unique, I believe, is that we have a lot of cooperation also between the banks themselves to really set up new projects. So we have at least 2 projects in terms of AML, so KYC project, where the banks, the 4 major banks, and then the others were added to the system after, agreed to share information in some way, or to really push something from scratch for identifying their clients, business or individual, and that works pretty well, to be honest. So obviously there are questions in terms of competition, and in the beginning it's complicated to have all these actors talking together openly on the topic that they can discuss on, obviously, but it works well. And I think there's a lesson to be learned, maybe not from Belgium itself, but I'm sure that in the future, given the challenges that we have, and indeed the markets that we have to compete with, collaboration, cooperation will make the market stronger in general. So definitely, yes, in my opinion, at least, it's a good thing.
I think it would be great to invite to such discussions panels really experienced large scale-ups and understand from them what they had to go through to grow and what should be changed, right? Because we're kind of talking a little bit among the you know, a smaller group, also somewhat siloed. So I think we need larger companies, you know, Klarnas of the world, you know, the founders, to come to the front and say, this is what needs to be done. I mean, we need to listen to them.
Very valid point. Lisa?
Yeah, I agree. Just wanted to say what we see with a lot of scale-ups, what's actually happening, or also companies basically on the growth path, is that they go for the big markets, right? So let's say a company is being founded in Austria, the logical next step is Germany, and then the logical next step would probably be the UK or even the US. And from a European perspective, I see somewhat of a risk potentially, not saying this is happening, but something that should be monitored quite closely, that when companies, and what's natural to them when they want to grow, they go for the big markets. And they don't go for the small markets, especially when it's a different regulation, when everything is new, etc., because it just probably won't pay off from a financial perspective. So I think this could be a big disadvantage. We're just leaving some markets behind and some countries behind, because it's just, from a business point of view, not rational to actually do that. So I think this is also something that we should keep quite clearly in mind, and something that we're seeing with some companies. And also, we've been quite active in the CE region, like really from also in Poland, luckily, and also Bulgaria, etc. And what we got as a feedback is, so why should we expand to Austria, for example, or even to Germany? Because it's just cheaper and more rational to actually go straight to the US. And I get this argumentation, but I think these are really big opportunities that are being missed, also from a society point of view.
And what do the others think? What could we do to foster exactly this, right? The whole ecosystem.
I think it's step by step. I mean, I would not stop a startup who has huge potential, because, you know, timing is everything. So if the time comes, you should go to the market that you can really grow the most. So nothing wrong with going to the US. Once you have a lot of power, you know, you can conquer smaller countries. I think we should not feel jealous that someone is, you know, going to another country. Let's support them anyway, right? I mean, the idea is to have strong companies, you know, in Europe. And they'll be strong if they can be global.
Any other thoughts on this?
No, it's in line with what I said earlier as well. I think that's probably a good idea. I think the more open your economy is, I think the more you will benefit, and the more attractive you will be for talent, capital, and others by default. So I think trying to restrain your companies is not going to work. At the same time, I do believe that there's a sort of ID fix that America is the promised land, which it's not one financial market, right? So you actually have license per state, and so there's a lot of hurdles over there as well. So I see actually also quite some entrepreneurs come back from their idea to conquer America and actually think that Europe is not that bad after all.
US companies coming to Europe, right? Trying to build their base here now. So that's also a good sign. So we've heard a lot. We've heard about the talent. We've discussed also the policy. We've actually discussed the ecosystem and what kind of strategy we want in Europe. But what we haven't yet touched on, and there's a lot of experts here in the panel, is the funding. Right, so I looked into, there's many stats out there, but one stats from CB Insights says 25% of the European unicorns out of all 120 globally are in Europe, 25%. So not so bad, but biggest hurdle, finance and funding. What do you guys think? I mean, Bogi, Lisa, Anders, also Don, there's so many viewpoints here. How can we improve this funding perspective in Europe?
Well, I think, in Poland, actually, there is quite a bit of risk funding that is offered by these private-public partnerships. I think generally it's positive that this was created, but it's not a very efficient way, right? Because whenever you have government involved, you create all sorts of constraints which, limit potential and possibilities. So I think capital is global. I think there's nothing wrong with, there are, other funds coming to the continent offering capital. I don't see capital as a huge issue because the biggest issue is knowledge how to scale, is experience. I think that's where the value lies. I mean, capital is the same, right? Capital is dumb. So I don't see capital as a competitive advantage. In many ways, I know in Europe, we think we have to create these national structures or international structures, and provide a lot of public money. I would be very careful. I just see a lot of money wasted.
I see the capital is important. In Sweden, we have a state-owned fund, which is then embracing early stage. They're not allowed to take lead, so they can invest up to 50%. And by that, they educate the business angel networks. It's been quite clever. It's been around now for almost 15 years. Directly initiated in the midst of the financial crisis, 2008. So it's evergreen, so it's always there. And again, it's always to complement. So they can only invest 50% in any funds early stage. That's one thing. It's been really good. I mean, the superstars, they handle it themselves anyway. The issue we have a few funds in Sweden. Norlin Creandum has been around since the late 90s. What they provide to companies is enormous amount of experience from other tech companies, international. So this, if you want to know what's happening globally in a certain tech area, the best ones you can talk to is those VCs, because they track everything on a global basis. So that if you have those involved, maybe not invest, but also to have the relationship, it gives you so much input to the company. And also they appoint some professionals into the board. They raise the level of the company dramatically, I would say. So maybe some of the mistakes that companies usually do are avoided, or at least they can handle it better. And what's been discussed in the last years is they come to a certain level. So let's say Klarna is not capital. They cannot expand with the investments from Sweden or even Europe. But it's now been better, so they can carry investments for companies all the way to a global scale. So you have investors in Sweden that can be alongside, not handing over to predominantly US investors. So I think it's important that you have European high-level investors that can carry the companies all the way to global expansion. So I think it's an important issue. It's nothing you can create in one day to another. So it takes time. But again, like Norlin, they've been around now for 25 years. Of course, they have enormous traction, enormous experience base to inject to any companies they invest in.
Yeah, you see also that COVID helps there, right? I think capital is becoming much more global and is finding its way throughout all the companies. But I think I think that was mentioned already before, is also the educational level, right? So how do you mentioned, I think, the Klarna mafia, like you will have the PayPal mafia, and I think we also know the Adyen mafia here in Amsterdam. So you actually see that these ecosystems where you get this density of knowledge and experience. And that's actually when people become able to actually compete for that money in a much better sense than before. Because I think Europeans are still behind on, for example, Americans, with their understanding of venture capital and how to build a 10x, 50x, 100x business. I think we're too modest and too nice to each other still, to repeat my first point.
But we also need to remember that VC is a good solution for a tiny percentage of companies, right? The VC model, when they take money from LPs and basically count on, 2 companies out of the whole portfolio working out, the VCs are not helping the whole portfolio. They're just helping the best horses in their portfolio. So we need to remember that VC is not a solution. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny product. So we need solutions which are much broader. So angels, education, like how to go for risk capital, that people with money, lawyers, many professionals who have extra cash, educating them to actually invest in startups, in early stage companies. That's critical, I think, because this kind of culture is persistent in the US, and that's what helps them a lot. Not everybody qualifies for VC.
Very true. And I think it's actually a good thing that not everyone qualifies for VCs, because I don't think that every company needs to become VC ready and needs to become a unicorn. But I think generally, and I think this is probably true for most countries in Europe, we really have a problem when it comes to equity investment. So I think also when we look at the German market or the German speaking market, for example, investing in companies, and now not only talking about startup investments, but also talking about stock exchange, etc. This is something that is still nothing that the majority of people is doing. So I think we really have an issue here of really educating on people when it comes to financial literacy, right? Because this is something that should become more common. And we can also talk about crowdfunding and other instruments here at the end of the day. But I think this is something that is not within our culture and something that we're not that used to, especially when we compare ourselves to the US or also to Israel, for example. So I think we really need to do something here on financial literacy, but also in terms of providing incentives, because if something is the case, then there is a lot of money in the European Union. And now we're only investing or leveraging this money by giving, well, not only, but big majority of giving really grants to companies and doing something. And this is great, especially in early stages for really companies that won't get money on the private market. But I think we should also find smart incentives on actually encouraging people to invest their own and private money, because I think this would again be interesting from a business point of view, but also from coming from a societal point of view. This could have a lot of benefits. And I think we have very good examples in Europe where this is working, and where also public-private partnerships are working. But some countries are not that good in adapting best practices for some reason.
Right, so very valid point, Lisa. More financial literacy and also more support of maybe smaller scale angel investment in Europe. So I think we could discuss 1 more hour, right? We only touched some of these topics, but we have a lot of takeaways and different topics that we would like to push in Europe, that we see in Europe, that we would like to push still in Europe. Maybe as a wrap up, I would like to have 1 word from all of you. So if you would talk to a potential scale-up in Europe, what would be the 1 thing that you would advise them to focus on? For instance, let me say one, hiring a public affairs advisor to push policy, an example. Maybe let's go through the round. Lisa, your 1 word for a potential scale-up.
Well, it's really sad that I need to start. Find the right people on every level, not only in terms of the team, but also in terms of investors.
Great, people. Bogi.
Yeah, join communities that are interlinked throughout Europe. Try to look for networks, people that you can quickly access information and talent.
So networks. Anders.
Yeah, I will say the same, to explore, not to, so if you want to go beyond your own country, you have to go there and explore, so you know the conditions. Footwork, I think is, and then by that you create the contacts, and by that you can recruit very cleverly. Right,
so explore more. Don?
I would say raise a sharp focus on your customer. And if you can show that you're doing good for your customer, you'll get anywhere.
Focus on the customer. And Joan, what would you say?
to try and stay flexible at all time, including in how the organization has to be managed, because going from startup to scale up is also something very complicated. That's what I see, at least. And it looks like it's nothing, but it's actually an important topic to continue working properly.
So keeping flexibility is so great. On that note, thanks to all of you, a virtual applause, and thanks for all the viewpoints. I hope all of you in the audience enjoyed to get a little bit of a glimpse into our European perspective. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.